Welcome to Lore Citizen, a podcast dedicated to all things Star Citizen lore. If you enjoy this, make sure that you like, subscribe, and follow all of our social medias. Without further ado, let's get started. Hello and welcome to another episode of Lore Citizen, a Star Citizen podcast where I'm bringing people from the Star Citizen community to talk about lore. So as always, I'm joined here by Algrid and Jale. I'll let them introduce themselves. Al, who are you? What do you do in Star Citizen, and where can they find you?
Well, as I said, I am Algard Beaumont of the Museum of Intergalactic or Interspecies Tolerance. No, I am Algard. I am a Star Citizen. I love the lore of Star Citizen. I love ships. And I am involved with info runners, and probably we're most well known for our series Fix My Fleet, where generally we will try to help people work out how to do the things they want to do in game for the best value. So yeah.
Yeah. All right. And Jale, who are you? What do you do in Star Citizen, and where can they find you?
I'm Jale. I'm known for cooking, but more actually known for doing alien language stuff. You can find my YouTube channel under the name Jale or Jale Star Citizen. Hopefully it'll be linked under this video as well, or you can look at my Twitter. You can find me on Twitter, tweeting about Star Citizen all day and night.
Everything ends up coming back to Star Citizen. By the way, this is the second time we recorded this because I screwed up my introduction. So if you hear some stuff, that's the reason why. If you're hearing some weird edit cuts, it's because I'm trying to cut out my own audio mistakes. So today we're talking about first contacts, humanity's first contacts with alien civilizations. And I'm going to get us started off with the very first contact that humanity had with an alien species, with the Banu. So let me set the scene. This is the mid-25th century, or early 25th century, really, in the heart of the golden age of expansion from humanity. We're only a couple, about a century or so out from the first jump point by Necroshaw. And the expansion boom, the formation of the UNE, all of this has happened before this point in the history. And we find ourselves in this situation in the system of Davian, which is right on the border between, it's actually one jump away from Earth, one jump away from Sol. And we find a nav jumper named Vernon Tar. Now, Vernon Tar is a nav jumper of some repute. He has some shady past, but he is hot on the trail of what he thinks is a jump point, which for nav jumpers is a huge deal, because nav jumpers, as you've probably heard in previous episodes, their main job is to pilot through jump points, which is not something that is usually done quite frequently by your average pilot. It takes a certain type of pilot to do this. They're also the ones who can chart jump points. They're the ones who have the experience and the skills inside jump points to be able to know where the exits are of jump points and so on and so forth. So he is hot on a career-making discovery of a new jump point when he sees another ship. Now, it's not uncommon for nav jumpers to compete for resources. So Vernon Tar does what he normally would do, and probably most nav jumpers at the time would do. He takes a shot at this ship. Why? Because he thinks this ship is honing in on a discovery that he himself had been desperately trying to track down, and he didn't want to play second fiddle to some guy who just followed him there. Fires, he misses. After he misses the shot, he realizes that the ship he shot at wasn't human. It was a design he'd never seen before. So he calls the UNE. The UNE, ever since this age of expansion into the various star systems all over the galaxy, had come to the conclusion at some point, likely early on, that they would probably run into some sort of intelligent alien species. So they created a task force specifically to delegate with first contact. That task force was the one that Vernon Tarr contacted, under the command of Neil Skokolovich. Said it right this time. Neil Skokolovich. The UNE would then bring this alien, this Banu, on board one of their ships. They nicknamed this alien Jerry, and they began to work out basic communications. They set up some beacons to try to figure out where this jump point was, where he likely came out of, where Vernon Tarr was looking for. And only a couple of days later, a Banu fleet arrived. After a couple of days, humanity and the Banu signed the first, let's see, make sure it was the actual name for it, Interstellar Peace and Trade Accord. Now, we learned fairly quickly that the Banu are a very exuberant race that loves new things. So one of the major exchanges that happened early on was that a lot of Banu culture managed to find its way into humanity, and a lot of human culture found its way into the Banu. So things like Luminalia, which is actually a human, but it's named after an actual Banu holiday, which I'm blanking on at this point. It has its own unique name for its for them, but involving exchanging of gifts through a unique structure called the Suli. Because the Banu are so they're so separated from each other, they're so independent. Each Banu is part of an organization called the Suli, with the head being an Esso Suli, which is sort of like like a cross between a trade guild and a family. So the Luminalia is a time when everyone's part of the same Suli, and so humans actually experienced something, this Luminalia, when they just kind of were hanging out. Some humans were hanging out around when Luminalia was happening, and the Banu just offered them to come sit by a campfire or sit with them, and they exchanged gifts, and the first human Luminalia kind of experience, and this kind of grew out. And of course, humans would then influence the Banu by introducing them to sports and Sadaball, which they took to voraciously. So this first contact is very much a combination of both human and alien kind of coming together. So yeah, that's the Banu.
Yeah, that interesting thing about the fact that Davian doesn't connect to Banu space anymore. Whether that's indicative of further shuffling that they intend to do as it comes about. There's no sense in keeping to an old star map if they've got more fun ideas coming up.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it could also be easily fixed by saying there was a jump point and it closed since. There's two other jump points that have just evaporated over time. Most famously the Farron Oratani, where we actually lost the Oratani system because of that. So that would be an easy fix for that wrinkle.
Yeah. It's an interesting look into the nav jumpers as well. Their culture. So.
Yeah, they kind of strike me as like prospectors, or in the initial version of this conversation, you were saying trappers.
Fur trappers. Yes, Al's muted, so I know he's trying to say something.
Thanks, Paul. I was saying trappers.
Yeah, trappers. For those of you who don't have kind of not known about the trappers of the Old West, they were often like pathfinders, like trailblazers, and sort of outlaws. They would likely kill one another for their furs, and so thinking of Vernon Tarr as this Old West trapper who's just out there trying to gun down somebody else who's trying to steal his furs, and ends up, nope, this isn't a trapper. This is a completely new species. This is a completely new people we've never met before.
And to pick up the idea of it being like a prospector, it's a prospector sitting on a mother lode,
Mm-hmm.
and others come along, and they'll take you out for that mother lode. So there is that sense of, he was a bit foolish in shooting first, but then being by himself, if he didn't shoot first, well, he might not have shot at all. Then he may have just been floating in the never regions for evermore.
Well, and as
So,
we
I
go ahead.
I think of these nav jumpers really do strike, at least in this story and the story I'm going to be telling, as kind of people who don't really thrive in civilized society, and they're out on the edge and they're a bit weird out there. I mean, these are people who make their living either hunting for the big score, which most of them will never find. So they're kind of people who like the kind of get rich quick idea, and flying through dangerous jump points to map them so that other people can do it safely. This is incredibly dangerous work, skilled work, but also you have to be wired pretty strangely to want to do it.
you have to be the right stuff.
Yeah.
And that's the idea. They do come across as guys with the right stuff. They're ace pilots in many ways, aren't they?
Yeah, good pilots, but terrible shots. Thankfully,
Which is probably a good thing.
Yeah. And I'll end this by saying that as we'll talk about a little bit later, there's this theme that you'll hear coming up of people doing the wrong things at the wrong time, and Vernon Tar is but a couple of centimeters likely away from starting the first intergalactic war. But he's not the first one to do. Luckily he wasn't. But doing the wrong things, living on the edge, and not doing the right thing, He eventually did do the right thing, did the wrong thing first. Tends to be how humanity, we kind of stumble our way ass backwards into contact. So with that, we're going to transition over to Jale. He's going to talk about the Xi'an.
So when you consider the recent decades of peace and cooperation between the human and the Xi'an peoples, the story of the first contact can only be considered kind of a tragedy. A catastrophic failure to understand one another that led to an entirely fruitless, centuries-long Cold War. And I want to look at both the first contact itself and the events of the subsequent couple of decades that led to that conflict, because I consider them very linked events. So by all accounts, 2530 was a pretty wild time to be alive. We're talking about the end of this big expansion era, but just 7 years earlier, the UNE had announced its reformation into the United Planets of Earth. So that brought with it this renewed sense that it was our species' destiny to spread out there and not just focus on Earth anymore. And it also brought a political change with the establishment of a more focused executive branch of government, and with that, a raft of new legislation aimed at regulating further human expansion, promoting it in a responsible way. However, it appears that the exuberance and greed outpaced the new regulatory powers, and some companies became infamous for flouting these regulations. It's against this backdrop that another nav jumper, Catherine Segovia, discovered a new jump point in the Baker system, into a new system that humanity would come to call Pallas, which is another name of Athena in Greek mythology. Her preliminary scans revealed mineral wealth in a potentially habitable planet. She saw that as dollar signs, or UEC signs. And soon she would line up an auction with the mining and terraforming conglomerates that she thought would pay the most for this information. The winners were Gaia Planet Services, the very most infamous flouter of rules and regulations in the newly formed UPE. To say they cut corners would be putting it mildly. They sent a terraforming team in immediately. They didn't register the system with the UPE, seek terraforming permits, nor even properly explore the system. Company CEO Joseph Jules Jr. was quoted as saying, "We'd rather pay the fine than waste the time." Had they done their due diligence, the 276-person terraforming team might not have been surprised by the Xi'an, who very much viewed the system as their own. They called it Thusung. The aliens captured the team, and despite the language barrier, they managed to identify the foreman of the team, a man named Charles Baxter. Much to the surprise of the captives, Baxter was permitted to return to his superiors as a sign of good faith. While the CEO and some of the board thought that Gaia Planetary Services should try to deal with the Xi'an directly, they lacked the necessary xenolinguistic skills and were ultimately forced to contact the UPE. It took 15 days before a rudimentary communication could be devised and the Xi'an demands translated. The UP were quite happy to agree to point 1 to retreat from the system, but were less happy with the other demand, to provide full charts of human space. That second stipulation seemed a very steep price to pay with a new potentially hostile alien race there. but there was significant pressure from the public and a dawning realization that these were very patient and probably quite long-lived aliens that could probably hold out quite a long time. So they eventually acquiesced, and that action of giving over loads of intel about the human empire to the Xi'an really sowed the seeds of the paranoia that would come to dominate the interspecies relationships. That bungled first contact, and this greedy and reckless cooperation, we're already off to a bad foot, on the bad foot. However, that alone didn't kickstart the Cold War. A few years later, the Tevarin would be discovered, and Al's going to tell you all about that quite soon. And during the First Tevarin War, a Navy officer, Armistead Perry, designated the uninhabited systems connected to the Xi'an Empire as no-fly zones and military staging areas, giving rise to the Perry Line, the no man's land between the two empires. Another product of the war was Ivan Messer. He used his fame to catapult himself into power as the High General in 2546, one of the 3 tribunal positions at the top of the UPE. Almost immediately, he began to argue for the abolition of the tribunal in favour of one dictatorial leader, Prime Citizen. It's not clear if he would have been successful were it not for the subsequent events that would be blamed on the mistrusted Xi'an. Cestulus, the second planet in the Davian system, where humanity first met the Banu. Most of its population lived under biodomes because of the thin atmosphere, most famous being enclosing the city of Jata, which is where Aegis dynamics are based. It was this dome that was brought down by a series of surgical explosions, killing thousands. An analysis revealed that the bomb components were Xi'an in origin. Immediately, Ivan Messer began using the attack as a justification for his political objectives. He told the press, "I have drafted a plan that will hunt down those responsible for the atrocity at Jata and ensure that this never happens again. If we had a prime citizen in place, these measures would already be in motion. Instead, the Empire must wait for the tribunal to convene and debate. Who knows how many more systems will suffer similar attacks by then?" Kind of weird that he's referring to it as an empire then, but okay. True to his dark prophecy, the atrocity at Jata was the first bombing in a series across the Empire. While the tribunal bickered, and Messer refused to support any other strategies beside his own, the Trade and Development Division building on Tram and Asuran, the Feron system, was attacked, killing 700 people. Ultimately, after approximately 5,000 civilian dead across 5 different systems, the populace would be terrified into believing that not only the attacks would continue, but that a strong leader was the only way to resolve the crisis. And so, the tribunal was thrown out in favour of Prime Citizen, Ivan Messer was elected, and the rest was history. That's when the United Earth Empire began. The rise of the Messer regime is intrinsically tied to alien threat. He gained power by defeating the Tevarin, and he consolidated that power into an imperial dynasty by presenting himself as the answer to the Xi'an threat, as he portrayed it. The Messer regime would continue to trade on that threat for their entire time in power, using to justify the exorbitant funding of military-industrial complex. But the surprising truth is, the Xi'an probably never planted those bombs. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of 2806 declassified thousands of secret documents. Sidney Kamark, historian of human political systems at the University of Rhetor, had taught our students in great detail about the significance of the attacks in precipitating humanity's move towards fascism. However, she always struggled with the question of why Jata had been the target. While investigating that question in the newly declassified archives, she found that one Cyrus Ishitaka had been arrested days before the attack for dealing drugs, but had been mysteriously released without charge due to the intervention of someone called Pat Mora. That was actually an alias of Adam Kaur. Both Ishitaka and Kaur had fought alongside Messer at the Battle of Idris IV, with Kaur specialising in infiltration, Ishitaka in demolitions, skills that would have been necessary to pull off the attacks. Through further investigation, Kamark was able to place Ishitaka at 4 of the 5 other systems in the days leading up to each attack. Kaur disappeared from the records but re-emerged upon Messer's ascension, suddenly being rewarded with a prominent military job. Meanwhile, Ishitaka turned up dead in a New York City alleyway a few days after the final attack with a gunshot to the back of the head, and in a previously sealed autopsy that had never been investigated properly, rare Xi'an explosives under his nails. Kamark's 2812 book, The Path to Prime Citizen, squarely blamed Messer, Kaur and Ishitaka for the bombings, and this new account became dominant in the court of public opinion. Now, to wrap that all up, it appears to me that the humans precipitated what would become the human-Xi'an Cold War. Yes, First Contact was a messy mistake on both sides. But you could argue that from a Xi'an perspective, they were quite reasonable. They found some trespassers, opened up lines of communication, and had a very brief 57-day negotiation. No time at all from their perspective. But then you have that thing about the star charts. That's a bit of a big ask. Yes, Cray come from House Cray, who run the Empire. They came from the world of military intelligence. But it wasn't friendly, but it wasn't overtly hostile. But would Mesa have been able to exploit that paranoia if it weren't for that bungled First Contact? It's a difficult question to answer. It does seem that he was acting very deliberately on something that was there, and that fear ended up governing the next few centuries of human civilization. So that's the story of Xi'an First Contact.
We look at the moon. We look at the moons in game at the moment, and we know Rahab's on. You can't see them from orbit, but you can at least see the major settlements. And I could imagine a research station not showing up.
It's pretty clear that GPS just went in there, just started hacking about, and didn't do the things that were expected of them. And then they were just like one of these fly-by-night terraforming companies that was around. This ended the human expansion era. Suddenly we were faced with a brick wall of an ancient empire, and we're like, guys, maybe the party's over. So big impacts.
For Xi'an and humans with that border skirmishes, it wasn't just humans doing it. There were also these situations where Xi'an were instigators or antagonistic as well. So there was a bit of to and fro.
There isn't any record of it in this era. I mean, there isn't really much hostility in this era other than that that appears to have been manufactured by Mesa. It was more. I mean, the only other interaction that really happens in this period, which I kind of glossed over, was that the Peri line was formed in the same year as we discovered a system called Gerzil, which is a developing system. It's just like there's not even really planets there yet. But then when people were exploring that, a Xi'an scout popped up, and we found a jump point through to the equivalent of like Norfolk, as in the big naval base. It is like Xi'an Navy Central, and that may have well precipitated the formation of the Peri line. But there wasn't really there was mistrust, but not outright conflict in this period at least. I think it'd be really good to do Xi'an Cold War at some point.
Certainly, the establishment of the Peri line really ties in with the incidents were going on as a result of the Tevarin First Contact.
That's a great segue. Let's start off with Algrid. You're going to be doing the Tevarin First Contact.
So, Tevarin First Contact is a tale of tragedy and begins with an impulsive, idealistic, and one could say naive young scientist who, by a single whisper, caused great pain and suffering. It is even possible to postulate that this young scientist is indirectly responsible for the rise of the Mesa regime. I speak of Dr. Keller Lynch, the celebrated scientist who discovered Elysium. In 2541, he was working on the planet Yaa in Centauri at a research facility of the New Horizons Research Institute, a subsidiary of the now dissolved and, dare I say, ethically bankrupt Hathar Group. The Hathar Group stripped mined worlds they controlled and neglected criminal activity, all in the name of profits. Some may say this seems eerily similar to the Hurston family's approach to the development of Hurston in the Stanton system, but I digress. We are fortunate that original copies of Dr. Lynch's letters to his father have survived to the present day and are held by the Gemma Museum of Interspecies Tolerance. In letters covering the 6th to the 15th of November 2541, we see his idealism and naivety, and more importantly, his impulsiveness. It is his impulsiveness, however, which is critical for understanding not only Tevarin First Contact, the conflict which followed, but also the conditions which gave rise to the Mesa regime. On the 6th of November 2541, Dr. Lynch declared his frustrations with working at Yaa research station for the Hathar Group. He had recently discovered the research facility was merely a front for the ethically and environmentally bankrupt Hathar Group, and impulsively decided to abandon his post. Many scholars laud this as demonstrating his extreme idealism. It highlights his naivety and impulsiveness. His naivety for not doing his due diligence and checking out the New Horizons Research Institute, and his impulsiveness for just deciding he was going to leave and even accepting the job. Let's see, where are we? I've lost the thought. Dear me. Yes. Soon after the 6th, Dr. Lynch submitted his resignation and, without waiting for a response from his employers, to use his own words, abandoned his post. From his correspondence, we learned that by the 9th he was on Sansai Century in Fujian City. He didn't remain in Fujian City long. We know from his correspondence that by the 15th of November 2541 he had discovered Elysium. And, despite his claims of leaving first contact to diplomats and dignitaries, we learn that in his impulsive rush for information, even after determining the system was inhabited by a spacefaring race, launched a drone to gather, or a drone or probe to gather more data. There are some discrepancy in the sources which indicate Dr. Lynch fired a drone. However, in his letter to his father on the 15th, he specifically refers to sending a drone to gather more information about the civilization in the system. However, it was only after his drone suddenly ceased functioning, and after he detected several alien ships headed towards him, that he chose to return to Centauri. First contact had occurred, whether he or humanity realized it or not. The launching of the drone is inexcusable, however, and highlights his naive and impulsive character. The historical records at Gemma clearly show he had ascertained the system was in fact inhabited. He wrote, "One of its worlds is teeming with advanced life. There were lights everywhere, large structures that looked like temples, and an impressive city built on a mountaintop. I so wanted to do deeper scans, but I didn't want to get closer, and figured it was best to maintain a safe distance for now." Yet, Dr. Lynch still sent his drone. Why is this seemingly innocuous event so significant to first contact? It is so significant because it was only a mere 11 years after first contact with the Xi'an. In the letter dated on the 15th, he even stated he left because he did not wish to cause a diplomatic incident, and yet his drone was a whisper. It had already caused an incident, as the approaching ships indicated. It can be argued that Dr. Lynch was guilty of either spying on the species or of firing the first shots in a war that eventually saw the destruction of a civilization and the near annihilation of a species. Dr. Lynch was also remiss in his assessment of the Tevarin, later claiming that they were as technologically advanced as the UPE, and that we should welcome into the UPE and raise the species to our level. The Tevarin declared war on humanity in 2541, shortly after first contact. Senior researcher of the Ark Institute, Dr. Will Weisbaum, in a public lecture on the 26th of April 2946, stated, "They were a spacefaring species, technology-wise, but quite advanced as us humans. We thought it was a great opportunity to expand our reach and incorporate an entire species into our civilization." However, the subsequent conflict demonstrated that Tevarin shield and stealth technology were superior to that of the UPE. The UPE was remiss in their view, but the Tevarin should be incorporated into the UPE. From a Tevarin perspective, these moves by the UPE were an imperialistic invasion. This adds significance to Dr. Lynch's drone survey. From the perspective of the Tevarin, this was an attack. While Dr. Lynch maintains he left first contact to the diplomats and dignitaries, his own letters clearly show he had in fact initiated first contact, whether he realized it or not. It is true that Tevarin had not yet developed terraforming technology, but this in no way supports the claim, often cited in history books, that the UPE was more advanced. In fact, in this first phase of the conflict, it resulted in a the UPE and UEE making a plethora of technological advances in ship design and technology. For example, significant advances were made by the UEE in shield and stealth technology, assets humanity appropriated from the Tevarin. The air shield we often take for granted were appropriated from Tevarin after the First Tevarin War. Adding insult to their defeat, humanity symbolically salted the earth, terraforming both the desert world of Voska and the Tevarin homeworld, Calith, which was also named Jale for human habitation. What is often referred to as the Second Tevarin War is really only the second phase of the conflict, and results from a Tevarin desire to regain the possession of their homeland, or their homeworld. As a side note, it is worth pointing out that there are indications that many Tevarin fled into both Xi'an and Banu space. Given the state of relations between the UPE or UEE and Xi'an, the Cold War that existed since 2530 and the establishment of the Peri Line in 2542, it is reasonable to propose that the Xi'an assisted and helped the Tevarin rebuild their fleet under funding Korathal, so as to fight a war by proxy against humanity. So, was this second phase of a conflict also the first Xi'an War? This is information and discussion for a later date. Despite having been victorious in the Tevarin Wars, however, we know relatively little about the species' history. After the first phase, many Tevarin had fled into the neighbouring empires, and following the death of Korathal and the cessation of hostilities, Tevarin set about destroying many of their records. Often, what remains are what the Mezzers preserved as some sort of galactic trophy of conquest. It is no wonder that there remains to this day a deep-seated distrust of the UEN amongst Tevarin, and why very few Tevarin seek citizenship within the Empire. In recent years, following the election of Tevarin Suzkosi as Senator for Jale or Caliph in 2946, there have been moves amongst the Tevarin to regain or learn about their past. It is, however, important to understand Tevarin culture and belief if we are to understand why this first contact led to the misery of the Tevarin Wars. Many Tevarin had turned to crime, and while some have served in the military, it was usually only when they were given the choice of military service or being sentenced to time in prison as jailbirds. Suzkosi himself has a criminal past and was one of those who served in the military, eventually earning citizenship. Another Tevarin who has served in the Navy is Soren Ashraf, a decorated veteran of the Battle of Vega II in 2945. Despite a distinguished and decorated service, they have experienced intimidation by xenophobic groups, nemesis, intent on preventing any Tevarin from voting in UEE elections. Within the Empire, prejudice and racism is endemic, and this is another impact of first contact gone wrong. Tevarin are not meek and mild. They are a proud species who value their word and a racial character trait, which seems to have been ingrained into their culture by Rajura. In the historical fiction Orbital Supermax, the Tevarin terrorist Yusuf Ashari is shown to be honourable, looking out for his people and in keeping and expecting others to keep their word. These character traits fit with the teachings of Rajura. What was Tevarin society like prior to the Tevarin Wars? Which resulted shortly after Dr. Lynch's first contact? It appears Tevarin society resembled medieval Japanese society. Although the military ruled and honour was gained through military exploits, everyone was cared for. Farmers were not seen as servants, for they served and provided for the population. Even the smallest can do great things. Even a whisper can break a silence. There is much disinformation about the Tevarin. For example, some sources indicate that they were carrion feeders, but this is clearly in contrast to the standing that farmers had within their society. More likely, this view is a result from Meza and xenophobic propaganda and the breakdown of Tevarin society, which transformed the Tevarin into a species on the edge, foraging for survival. To understand the Tevarin and their reaction to first contact and actions in the conflict that followed is to understand Rajora, their religion or code of conduct. Unfortunately, few complete texts and, more importantly, commentaries of Rajora are available today. However, it is fundamentally because of the teachings of Rajora that Tevarin are, as a species, honourable. They will seek to do their duty and keep their word, as is seen in the portrayal of Yusuf Ashari. If they make an error, they would, because of Rajora, seek to correct that error. Contrary to the image that Rajora creates suicidal fanatics, a view made popular by Khorafsal's Death in the Clouds of Caliph, the Rajora forbade suicide. It reminds me of Shakespeare. Oh, that the everlasting had not toned his cannon against self-slaughter. Rajora decreed honourable surrender overall when one's back is against the wall. The death of Khorafsal and his failure to issue the instrument of surrender and the destruction of the Tevarin battle fleet in the terraformed clouds of Caliph was fundamentally an act of dishonour against the very teachings of Rajora. This decree in Rajora is equally tied to another Rajora maxim: go forth with head held high, honour the ground and respect the sky. One must keep those goals in mind if we are to survive. It is said that this teaching dated back to the 16th epoch of Tevarin society, at a time when they huddled in the caves of Caliph. The whole of Rajora focused upon the survival of a species. It was a reminder to the military that they fought for the survival of a species. It was a reminder to the farmers that they worked for the survival of a species. Now, when presented with the UPE's expansionist desire to incorporate Tevarin society into the UPE and Dr. Lynch's spy drone, we see the Tevarin declaration of war as primarily a war of survival for the species rather than a war of acquisition. Similarly, Rajuris taught it is strength to know one's weakness. As such, when one knows their weaknesses, to work with others is to be complemented and strengthened. This approach was used by the Tevarin when crewing their Jackal scout fighters. We know that Banu often appropriate designs that work from other races, and records indicate that the Jackal was a scout fighter with pilot and dedicated phalanx shield and scanner operator, and this is almost identical to the setup that we find in the Banu Defender, which still uses Tevarin phalanx shield technology and has a dedicated shield and sensor operator. So we see the Rajoran teaching working in their ships. Individually, I may be weak, but together we are strong. Rajora is not merely about military might and strength. Another teaching of Rajora states it takes a single whisper to break a silence. This teaching encouraged even the smallest to do their best, because the smallest action can have a significant impact. Rajora teaches that there is a reason for everything. You are where you are meant to be, even when you do not understand. The defeat of Khorafsal by Squadron 42 at the Centauri's jump point should have, where Rajora followed, resulted in the issuing of the instrument of surrender, rather than the dishonourable act of suicide in the clouds of Caliph, which ignored the needs of the many. When we consider the Tevarin purge following the demise of Khorafsal, there are two possible reasons. The first holds that the purge was an attempt to prevent humanity from acquiring Tevarin technology. But is this an honourable surrender? And this view is also in error because following the First Tevarin War, the UPE, or soon to be the UEE, had already appropriated much Tevarin technology, making significant advances in ship and component design. So the question remains, why the purge? It seems more likely that the purge was a reaction to Khorafsal's failure to follow Rajora. This created such a with his dishonourable suicide and his refusal to issue the instrument of surrender, it caused a cultural stain upon the species so great that they no longer believed they should or could follow the teachings of Rajora. To return to the topic of first contact with the Tevarin and the events that directly followed, I return to Dr. Keller Lynch's drone survey and quote Rajora. Even a whisper can break a silence. Even a drone can start a war. And there you go.
Thank you for coming to our TED Talk. That's very good. It's a good point, and I think that's something that is we're going to explore a lot in Star Citizen, and I think we need to do an episode on the Tevarin Wars. We need to do an episode on the rise of the UAE, the Xi'an Cold War, the Banu relationships, all those sorts of things. Yeah.
It was certainly very hard to separate the war from first contact, and even the second war from
it's
first
impossible.
Contact, because
it's impossible.
They're just so entwined.
Yeah.
But yeah.
To float a potential fly in the ointment, do you think that there's some symmetry in the fact that the two first contacts that occurred right at the start of the fascist period are kind of lessons in, don't disobey what the government says, you might start a war? Do you think there might have been some tweaking there by the messes?
Possibly. But the problem is that those letters came in afterwards.
Yeah.
Because a lot of this stuff was covered up because they wanted to blame the Tevarin, because we actually do have at least some records that indicate that Tevarin took the opportunity to attack humanity because they hadn't just developed their own terraforming technology, and they needed places to go, and they just didn't have it. At this point they only had one colony that we knew of, which would be abandoned shortly after the First Tevarin War, and so they really only had one place they could go to live, and they were growing dramatically because they hadn't experienced a major war in I don't know how long by that point. So they were experiencing the same thing that early Earth was, only, a couple hundred years before. And we knew what happened at the early Earth stages, and they even unified with each other and developed terraforming. You still had the unification wars. So the humanity was always this excuse for the Tevarin to go to war, at least in a little bit of cases. So with that already being out there, the Mezzers are much more likely to say, see, evil aliens, the Xenos are evil, they're going to kill us all. We need to kill them first, So yeah.
But based on the list of what they say GPS did wrong with the Xi'an, one of the things you're supposed to do is if you find a new system, you're supposed to report it to the government immediately. And it sounds like this chap didn't quite do that.
No,
so
he didn't. He sat there for at least one account I swear I came across, and it's one of those things I just wish I could find. Said that he stayed there for a couple of days, kind of scanning and checking things out, and then launched his drone. And it was only when, oh shit, there are 3 ships coming for me, I better run away. But he fled. He actually he does initiate first contact. He does first contact. Yeah, he leaves it for the dignitaries to try and fix it up, but he's done it. He's already got the Xi'an on offside. He's already got
the Tevarin, yeah.
Yeah, he's already got the Tevarin offside. He's already got them worried about, this race. And then the UAE comes on and says, oh, yeah, we'll incorporate you into our civilization. I was like, hey, no, we're an independent people. What do you do if you're faced with that? Do you just let them come in and do it? Or do you proactively engage? And so I think part of the history we've got is Meza-focused history. But I think there is also an element where the Xi'an, yes, if we win, we do get living space. But I don't think it was they were acting as a war of acquisition. I think for them it was literally that following Rajora, it was a war of survival. It was a war of protecting the species and protecting their sovereignty and independence. And that just seemed to come through more and more and more. And I could have swore I saw a video of either Adam or Will saying that the Tevarin decided to attack the invaders, and it was that one line that sent me down the rabbit hole. And certainly the lines in terms of Yui adopting and incorporating the Tevarin into their society does seem to imply that there was more push.
More coercion.
And I think that had an impact on certainly the Tevarin. And when you look at Rajora and what Rajora says, and the snippets we've got of Rajora, you start to go, okay, yeah, they are working out of that. And so,
well, remember, kids, next time you find a jump point that's undiscovered, report it to the local UEE office. You can't get away with this. You're going to start another war. Just do the right thing.
Gosh!
When you find a jump point leading to the
Cathach or the Van. Oh my gosh! That's what's going to happen. Some player's going to find a jump point to the Cathach and start another war. That's what's going to happen. CIG, it's going to. Thank you, CIG. Thank you for this in the future.
A war, a cold war. Hey,
I think that'll be quite a hot war.
Or
yes,
or we'll find a link to the Cathach. We'll have good relationship with them, and the Xi'an will then say you. So either way, yes.
No, knowing this player base. Go ahead.
If people haven't been following the Alien Week lore about the Cathach, there was this letter from the Xi'an from during their Spirit Wars, and it was portraying, from the Xi'an perspective, the Cathach as like almost worse than the Vandal. They were killing young adults just to kill them, basically, to like really stab it to the Xi'an. Leave actually not even leave none alive, leave some just about alive enough to suffer. So I don't think we'll get on well with the Cathach.
No, as I say,
not.
And knowing the player base, they're gonna be like, "Ooh, alien! I'm gonna shoot it." I don't know what that is. I'm gonna kill it first.
That's right. Let's capture it and put it in a cage. Yeah. Yes. That's I want a trophy on my wall. Yes, that's the type of thing that the player base will do, and the player base will say, "Oh yeah, we can beat them. We took care of Xeno's threat, and
we'll be fine." Thank you guys for coming in and talking about First Contact. We'll be going on.
Pleasure.
We'll be continuing on with another episode. I don't know exactly what the theme is. We'll figure that out here shortly. But make sure that you're following Jale and Al over on their social medias, the Info Runners and Jale's YouTube. Just look for, I think it's just Jale under YouTube, should be able to even find it, because I think that's usually what I do, or Jale Star Citizen will pull it up. And if you like this, like the video, comment down below. You may be hearing this on an audio format, because that should be coming shortly, possibly with this episode. Who knows? A pure audio format. Yeah, like I say every time, hope to see you someday in the black. And remember, Ex Historia ad Astra.